There we go. So welcome YouTube. Hello. Give us a wave in chat. Ask your questions by all means. Here for event-driven development with Joe Dixon, leveraging the observer design pattern in Laravel. Should be good. Just a quick note on upcoming events. We've got something Vercel. We've got a placeholder in here. We're looking to speak to or speak about Vercel and the Next.js framework. It may end up being Sean talking about it, which should be interesting. Python Lean Coffee, week after that, so following on from the same Agile Lean Coffee format as the React event, should be good. Data Science, IoT, talk about what you're doing with Python on a day-to-day, answer some questions, grievances, etc. Digital Investigations at Norfolk Constabulary should be a really interesting event. We've got DS, Detective Sergeant, I think that means, coming to speak to us about their Digital Investigations team, which is a new team as part of Norfolk Constabulary. They're looking at solving crimes and also presenting those crimes to juries in a understandable format. So it should be a good, interesting evening. Virtual Social Club. Come join us Fridays, 5:30 till late. Just drop in. As usual, Sean is still the holder of the best outfit so far. So by all means, push him off that podium. Discord, I shall drop a link in chats all around. If you aren't in the Discord, you should be. It's where get those questions answered and join us for some memes, and cryptocurrency chat has been the focus of this week. Shoutouts. Again, as usual, I've forgotten the list. But if you're looking for a role, there are many going. Give us a shout on the Discords, give us a shout on Twitter. If you're looking for work, if you're looking for people, also do give us a shout. We'll connect the two dots. Also, if there are any shout outs from anybody on chat at the moment, I'm having a little look around, but by all means, take the time to shout out now. Looks around the room. Weird. Right. Anyway, as usual, I'm going to get out of the room, get out of the way, get on with it. I'll pass over to Joe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Let me just set up the screen share. Bring up my notes. Cool. Can you see my screen okay? Nice. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Dixon, and I'm going to be talking to you today about leveraging events to build flexible backend and dynamic front-end experiences. So I'm just going to kick off with a little bit about me. This is mainly just to make me feel a little more relaxed, so feel free to switch off for this slide if you like. But yeah, so my name's Joe. I have been married to my wife for now, well, will be 7 years on Monday. So thankfully have remembered to buy an anniversary present this year. So I should be in good books. I've been a dad now for 4 years to my little girl, Ruby, down there on the right. And for now 18 months for my little boy, Jude. So naturally, you can probably imagine I don't get a huge amount of sleep anymore. I've been software developer now for over 10 years. And for over 6 of those years now, I've been a big proponent of the Laravel framework. I work as CTO at Ubisend. You may, for those of you from Norwich, you may have seen our huge obnoxious robot signs on the top of Burr Street. If you've been past recently, you'll also see that nobody's clearly been in the office because it's completely overgrown and looks a little bit like a jungle out the front of the office. So please ignore that next time you walk past. I am an open source contributor and maintainer. Fairly recently, for those of you who are interested and use Laravel, there's a community forum called laravel.io. And about a year or so ago, I got involved in that project. I'm now co-maintainer on that project, and we're pushing some really cool features onto that, which is nice. I occasionally write. I have a blog at joedixon.co.uk. I wouldn't bust a gut to get over there now because I haven't written for some time, but I like to as and when I can find the time. And judging by the state of my expanding waistline, I'm becoming more of an infrequent runner, but I do enjoy to get out there as and when I can. I should point out at this point as well, I've primed Alex that if any questions come up on the way through, feel free to shout them out as and when. I'd rather run this as like a collaborative session. So if anybody has questions or I'm moving too quickly or whatever, please do shout out. Cool. Okay, so what are events? Well, within programming, there are lots of different types of events, and generally they all seem to have a slight variation on the same theme. Today, I'll be talking about the publish subscribe design pattern, or pub/sub for short. Events allow us to define essentially a one-to-many relationship between objects in our code base. With the pub/sub pattern, what that typically looks like is we have a publisher that lets our application know that something has happened or some state in the application has changed. And then we can define one or more listeners which subscribe to the event that's been fired, and when called, they'll carry out some additional functionality. As an example, let's imagine that we have a blog, and let's say that when a user publishes a new blog post, they want to post that, they want to post that on social media. Well, that's a perfect use case for events. We would fire an event to say the post was published at the point that the user clicks the publish button, and then we would have a listener listening for that event that then carries out the task of posting posting the article onto Twitter. So why are events, in my opinion, a good idea? Well, the main benefit, in my opinion, is that they decouple the sender of the event from the receiver. So going back to the blog post example, we probably shouldn't be programming our controllers to talk to a Twitter service of some description to post that tweet for us. It makes sense to abstract that code away from the controller and into something which some other service, so a listener which contains that code. We can also define multiple listeners. So let's extend our blog post example and say, well, now we've got the Twitter example nailed, but now our customer wants us to be able to post to Facebook. Well, it's now really easy. We already have that listener fired, that event fired, sorry. We just define a new listener which integrates with some sort of Facebook service and shares the post there as well. We also have the flexibility of deciding when those listeners should be processed. So sometimes, rarely, I would argue that the main use case of events and listeners is that those listeners are jobs which need to be carried out the scope of the current request. But there are times when you may want that code to execute during the current request lifecycle, and that's totally possible. But we also have the ability to queue those listeners, and so that they can be executed at a different time. So just before we get into a little bit more theory, I just wanted to go through a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm not just a PHP developer, but that's where I enjoy spending most of my time. Don't at me for that. The code samples that we're about to see are specific to Laravel, but the theory transfers to any backend language. It's just that Laravel gives us a little bit of a leg up in some of these particular examples. So that's the framework we're going to go through. Okay, so in a Laravel application, we can define events really, really easily. They are just a simple plain PHP class. The purpose of the event class, in this case, in the pub/sub design pattern that I went through earlier, this would be the publisher. So the whole purpose of this publisher class is to define the properties which are accessible to all of the listeners listening to that class. So in this case, we have a public property called post, and that's the extent of what our event class actually looks like. And listeners don't get really much more complicated than the event class themselves. Again, they're just a simple PHP class. They define a handle method, which basically, when this is in the context of Laravel, just to reaffirm that, but when the event is fired, the listener, Laravel will call this shares post on Twitter class or instantiate a new object, and it's going to go ahead and call the handle method on that object. The handle method will receive the event that we saw and that we provided on the previous slide, and any public property on that event will be available to us on that event object. So we can go ahead and do anything that we want within that handle class. Again, some of the nice things we get with Laravel is that we can type hint dependencies in the constructor, and Laravel's going to go ahead and grab those for us from our inversion of control container. Listeners are also really, really customizable, but we'll come on to that a little bit later on in the presentation. So now that we have our event classes and our listener classes defined, how do we go ahead and tell the framework about them? There's a few different ways that we can do this, but probably or typically the most common example is to add them to the listen array of the event service provider that ships with the framework. And what we have is an array of keys as the event class, and then we can define an array of listeners which should be executed when that event is fired. That's really as simple as it gets. But it doesn't stop there. So we also have the ability to use facades in Laravel. Facades are basically a way of us, they're a bit of a contentious thing within the Laravel community or within the PHP community at large, but basically they provide us with a way of accessing or statically accessing classes that are bound to our inversion of control container. So we can use the event facade and call the listen method on that underlying class. And then we can inline a callback, which should be called when that event is fired. There's a couple of things to point out here as well. Sorry, I should mention as well that those need to be added to the boot method of the event service provider. What you might see down here on the screen is that wildcards can be useful. So what we can also do is we don't actually have to listen for a specific class or a specific event. We can listen for a whole namespace of events. So Laravel itself, we'll come on to this a little bit later as well, but Laravel itself ships with a load of events that it fires as part of the framework process. And they're all in different namespaces, but there may be more than one event in the same namespace. So for instance, here, if I wanted to listen for every event on the Illuminate auth namespace, I can just type that, and then with a star wildcard character at the end, an asterisk wildcard character at the end, I'm going to be able to listen for all of the events within that namespace, which is pretty powerful. So more recently, it's actually not that recent anymore, but probably a year or so ago, Laravel decided to add the feature that would automatically register events and listeners. So there's no need to, if you don't want to, this is again totally optional. You can choose any of these options, but there's no longer any need to go and, let me get back to the slide, to manually define them in this way if you don't want to. You can tell Laravel where your events and listeners live, and basically it will then go away and interrogate those directories. It's going to go ahead and look for, let's get back to a listener. Where are we? It's going to go ahead and look for a listener, and more specifically the handle method on those listeners. And provided your event is type hinted within the handle method, it's going to go ahead and register that the fact that when the post was published event was fired. It's automatically going to go and register the listener share post on Twitter. So you may think that that sounds like the most useful option, but just be wary that if you do that and you also register them manually, then your listeners will get called twice, and that has bitten me before, and it's not a nice problem to solve. You also have, so I talked about synchronous listeners as well. So those are the listeners which get fired as part of the request lifecycle. You also have the issue that you have no control over the order that they're executed. So if I go back again to the registration, where are we? That was that one. Imagine that we had a whole array of listeners here. So we had share post on Twitter, share post on Facebook, etc., and we wanted those for whatever reason to process synchronously. the order that you define them when you register them manually in this way, they're going to execute in that order. Whereas when the Laravel automatically registers them, it's going to do them in the order that it finds them in the listeners directory. Which again, I mean, I would argue if you run into this problem, you may be setting up your events and listeners in the wrong way. But that is something that you could run into. Is that the last one? Yeah. Okay, finally, we have the option to subscribe to events. Now, this is quite useful if you have, you can listen to multiple events from a single subscriber class. And the way that we do that is, again, within the event service provider, we have this subscribe property. And within the subscribe property, we can define an array of subscriber classes. Now, within those subscriber classes, we have a subscribe method. And within there, we can define multiple events, and they can reference methods within the same class or different classes. So again, it's just entirely a preference thing and probably depends on your use case, but it's just another way that you can register events within the application. So now that we have our events defined, we have our listeners defined, and we have both the events and listeners registered within the application, how do we go about dispatching those events? So this is the part of the application where we have our content management system and the user presses the publish button. How do we get that event to fire? Well, this would typically, it can happen anywhere within your application, but typically in the context that I've given for the blog post publishing, that's typically going to happen in your controller. And there's basically 3 different ways that you can do that. I would argue probably the most common is to use the global helper function. And all we have to do is type the function, instantiate a new instance of the event, and pass in the dependencies of that event. We can do the same thing again with the facade. So this basically is what this event global helper is doing under the hood. It's going to call the event facade. It's going to call the dispatch method on the underlying dispatcher class. And it's going to go ahead and pass in the new event like we did previously. And again, we can resolve the actual underlying dispatcher class, the class which is actually responsible for dispatching the events. We can grab that from the container and dispatch that manually. It's probably important to note here that these are kind of sugar on top of this dispatcher class. So basically all of these are doing the same thing, but this is probably the most obvious how it's actually happening. These are a little bit more magical, but also keep your code a little bit more concise. And I mentioned earlier that Laravel itself actually ships with lots of events. This slide is probably a little bit old. I think there's a few more now. But at the time I wrote this, there were 46 native events. So everything from when the cache is getting hit, to console events, to migrations starting and ending, anything where something is happening within the application, Laravel generally exposes to us as an event so that we can tap into that. And I found this useful in the past for things like message sending. If I'm sending an email from my application and I want to add additional headers to that outgoing email, I can tap into that event and do that from there, which is pretty useful. All right, so that was all the theoretical side of things. I didn't mention at the beginning, which I normally do, and I totally forgot, is that hopefully you're all up for a bit of audience participation because it gets a little bit more fun from here. So I'm going to demo some of these events in action. And what I have, so basically my whole slide deck here is a Laravel application with a Vue.js front end. It's running some WebSockets under the hood so that I can listen for things happening and I can broadcast that to visualize things on the front end. So what I'm doing on this particular page is just listening. Again, I mentioned earlier about wildcards. So here I'm listening for everything on the Illuminate name. Oh, excuse me, sorry. I'm listening for everything on the Illuminate namespace, which if I go back a slide or two, is basically every event that Laravel fires as part of the framework. So what I'm visualizing for you on this page is basically every single event that's being hit as from me even just viewing this application. So you can see there's quite a lot going on under the hood, and I think it's quite powerful to see the number of events that are actually being fired at this particular time. Cool. So we're going to do a quiz to visualize some of these a bit further. Oh, somebody's quick on the ball. So if you can hit leveragingevents.com, you should be hopefully presented with a screen that says it's quiz time. Can you just give me a nod if that's right? Yeah, and hopefully we'll start to see the users connected numbers going up. And now you can see more and more events being fired. I have some queue jobs running in the background, so you can see this queue events looping is the jobs being processed. There's some cache hits going on. There's some queries being executed. There's probably some login events. I'm not harvesting anyone's details or anything. I'm just basically creating an anonymous user every time you hit that page. Jesus, there's a lot going on. So yeah, so it's just to kind of visualize exactly what's going on under the hood in a Laravel app, even on a simple page like this that isn't really doing a whole lot. Okay. Okay, so we're going to show you now a simple custom listener. So previously we showed all the native listeners firing. This one is now me creating my own custom event. Again, I previously showed it was just a simple PHP class that has a store vote, and in a minute I'm going to open the vote, move the question on your quizzes, and you'll see this event firing in real time. We have a handle method, and all that handle method is going to do is create a new record within the database. Okay, so if I click here, you should now have a question up on your page. Hopefully. All right, so we get the most contentious one out of the way first, tabs versus spaces. All right. All right, spaces wins, good to see. We can also see here that there were, again, some native events being executed as part of that. There's some database stuff going on under the hood. But you can also see my custom event was fired here. It was fired 13 times, which matches to the 13 votes that we've had cast. So what I didn't mention earlier is that we can actually stop the propagation of an event. If at any time we return false from one of our handlers, this really only works for synchronous handlers because, as I've mentioned previously, synchronous handlers are going to get, or synchronous listeners, I should say, are going to get handled one after the other in sequential order. So if from the first one I return false, it's not going to go on and do the second one. Whereas if I'm queuing those listeners, they are totally independent of each other at that stage. So the second listener has no idea that the first one returned false. So imagine a scenario where we're building an application and we need to process some data. We're all in Europe here, so we know the trials and tribulations of GDPR compliance. So let's say we've got some processing that we need to do internally on our own application. But any data that it's a terribly contrived example, but any data that we get from a country outside of the EU, inside the EU, we don't want to send it off to a third party for processing. But any data we have from a country outside the EU, we're happy to send that off. I mean, hopefully nobody's doing this, but it's just a contrived example. So all I'm doing here is saying I've got an array of countries basically up here. And if the person sends in a vote or sends the response that they send into the question is anything in the list of European countries that I have, it's going to return false and it's not going to move on to the next listener. Whereas if it is something, so hopefully somebody can put USA or something in just to simulate, just so I can actually show this working. If somebody puts a country outside the EU, it's going to go ahead and execute that second listener. All right, second question should be appearing for you now. All right, cool. So you can see the event that was vote 2 was cast. And you can see that we had, okay, it's caught up now. That was slightly worrying for a second. We had 9 persisted locally and only 7 sent, or sorry, 7, 8, 9, whatever, sent to the third party. So the difference of 2 there means that those 2 people sent in a country that was in my list of European countries. So probably not something you're going to use on a daily basis, but something that's probably quite useful to have in your tool belt. All right, so this is handling errors. So we can actually tell Laravel what to do if a job fails. It only works on queued listeners, or queued jobs, I should say, and it only fires when the configured number of attempts is reached. So how Laravel queues work is that you can define the number of attempts a job should be tried before, if it throws an exception, before it fails completely and never gets tried again. Well, this failed method on the listener is only going to get fired when that configured number of attempts has been reached. So I'm going to open up the next question. All right. Okay. So I purposefully created an error in my listener here to make this happen. And I basically popped up an error to simulate that that's actually happened. And people are still submitting their results now. So this is something that I haven't touched on yet, sort of purposefully, but this is where the kind of dynamic front end functionality within Laravel's events comes in. And this is literally how I built this whole slide deck. So every time an event is occurring and every time a listener is executing, I'm broadcasting that event to the front end. It uses WebSockets. So Laravel ships with, I think now only 1 driver for WebSockets, which is Pusher, a third-party service. But this app is actually powered by an open source package called Laravel WebSockets. And the guy that built Laravel WebSockets has basically built the API to be exactly the same as Pusher. So you can literally swap these straight in. So if you're looking for open source WebSockets, then in PHP, which is, again, probably something that shouldn't be done, but has been done and actually works really, really well, that's a really good package to use. And so basically what I can do on my listener is define how I want my event to be broadcast to any front-end application. Laravel also ships or has a first-party JavaScript package called, I've totally forgotten the name. It will come back to me in a minute. Yeah, anyway, which ties in really nicely with Laravel events and the way that they are handled and sent to the front end. But you can literally, from any JavaScript framework that you're using, you can tap into these broadcasted events. Laravel has a whole load of nice helper objects, or helper classes, I should say, to determine how those events should be broadcasted. So here I'm quite often using presence channel, which is basically a way of letting you know that somebody's on the socket. That's how I was doing the number of active users at that particular time. You can do private channels if you want to send it to individual people, and you can just broadcast messages to everybody if that's what you want to do. And then you can tell it what it should broadcast with. So this is just a plain PHP array, which gets converted to a JSON object and sent through to the front end. And I think I have one more question here.
There's some contention over the fact that we didn't see the results of the view and react.
Oh. Oh, that's because, sorry, yeah, no, that question is designed to fail, essentially.
Oh, no.
But maybe after the talk, we can do like a raise of hands.
I'll set up a Zoom poll or something.
So yeah.
Not entirely sure what those emojis are on my Linux computer at the moment.
Oh no. Maybe you could screenshot and I'll translate. So everybody's on the fence with type hints, mostly on the fence, or type hints in favor of type hints is catching up. But this is really, really powerful stuff. You can see that using a little bit of WebSockets and solely Laravel events and broadcasting, I've been able to create this really, really rich UI that works both from a presentation perspective and also allows people to interact with the slides and have an impact on what's happening on the screen, which is pretty cool. And then finally, just wanted to demo queued listeners. So this is typically how I would normally use listeners in my own applications. I'm generally using a listener because I want to carry out some piece of functionality which doesn't affect the speed of my response back to the user. So I want that to be shoved away and done at a different time. It doesn't have any impact on what I need to send back to the user. It's just a job that I need to be carried out as part of an action that a user has performed. And I don't care when that happens. So I'm going to shove it on a queue. And that's typically used for things like, so the two examples I gave at the beginning of posting to Twitter and posting to Facebook, it's those kind of things when you've got a network request that you need to make, and those are typically slow and have an impact on performance of your application. Those are the kinds of things that you want to use queued listeners for. So what I'm doing with this one, I have a company within the Laravel community called thermostat.io, and they do net promoter score surveys basically. And I wanted to give an example which kind of tied in with the quiz that I was doing. So I contacted them and they were helpful enough to give me a free plan to actually demo this within the app. So basically what's going to happen here, when I give you the next question, go easy on me on this one, could hurt my feelings. But basically it's going to give you a net promoter score question. You're going to answer that question. It's going to go off and send the data off to thermostat.io, and then we'll be able to see what effect that's had on the back end. So hopefully that's going to appear with you now. And I'll just give it a couple of minutes. I'll see some more votes being cast. So that sent the data off to thermostat, and thermostat give us a way of, if you were using thermostat in real life, they give you like a public page which you can share to show if you were doing net promoter score for your own company, it would show you how well you're doing. You can make that data available. And if I click here, not bad. One detractor, can't win them all. So yeah, that's kind of a queued listener. So that's the quiz finished. Hopefully you enjoyed it. But in summary, I really like using events. I think they have people have a bit of a Marmite reaction to events. Some people don't like it because it hides, or in their opinion, hides code away. But this is something in particular in the Laravel framework, it's baked into the framework. So if you know that events are a thing, you're probably going to know to go and look in the events and listeners directory and interrogate your event service provider to see what's happening when certain things happen in your application. I really like them because they allow me to keep my controllers nice and clean, and they allow me to decouple parts of my code. They allow me to perform multiple different actions when in response to something happening within my application. And I like them because they don't depend on each other, so they can be processed asynchronously. If I have 5 different listeners listening on an event, I can shove them all onto a queue, and I don't care what order those things happen in. Those should all act independently of each other. The built-in queuing stuff with Laravel makes this really, really simple, and the broadcasting stuff, which is basically what's powered this whole slide deck, makes it possible to build really rich and reactive front-end experiences. But as always, they're not a one-size-fits-all solution. You need to use your common sense and try and figure out when they make sense to use them in your own application. There are things I probably would have done in this slide deck where I wouldn't have used events, but I was using them just to demonstrate, how they can work and the power that they can give you. So that's me. If you're interested to find out more, then you can ping me on any of those channels. And yeah, the slides themselves are made with Laravel WebSockets View and Tailwind. And I'm definitely a Laravel and Tailwind fanboy. So Vue not so much. I'm more in the React camp now if anybody's actually interested. So yeah, if anybody's got any questions, please shout now.
Tell us more about your move from Vue to React.
So
just to pick the contentious issue.
Well, so at my work, we have quite a varied tech stack. So basically at UBCM, we build chatbots. And the tech
Right.
stack for a chatbot actually is quite varied. So we typically power all of our chatbots with a Laravel backend. We have Node.js, which we use for socket connectivity. We don't actually use Laravel WebSockets for anything because probably PHP shouldn't be used for WebSockets. We use a bit of Python for natural language processing. We use, and then we didn't really have any strong in-house front-end skills for a long time. And then we employed somebody who was very much in the React camp. And I'd basically been tinkering a bit with Vue because I was using Laravel, and Laravel and Vue seemed to go hand in hand at the time. And then I had my eyes open to React, and I just think it's much, much more powerful and expressive.
Interesting. When you say WebSockets on PHP don't make sense, is that because there's no long-standing process that you can hook into? How does that actually work? Does it just run a never-ending request or something? Like how does it do it?
Honestly, I've never looked at the package. I've just installed it because
and it just works fine.
And it just works. It's actually really good. And if you read the documentation, the number of simultaneous connections you can have on it is much higher than you would think it would be.
Yeah.
But it probably doesn't make sense to use that in production, I would argue.
Fair, yeah. But that's why it's handy to have the swappable drivers for it, I suppose, because
exactly, yeah,
Pusher can handle that for you, but you can still have a development build that works locally, I guess.
Exactly,
yeah.
Or if you're building a slide deck where it's going to have limited number of people interacting with it, it's probably fine.
Fair. And yeah, like quality slides, very impressive. Nice.
Thank you.
Did you build this especially for this talk? Well,
no, I
guess you're planning on doing a series of talks on the subject.
I've given this talk twice now. Gave it a Laravel Live in London this time last year, and then October, I think last year, I went over to Germany, did Code Talks which is in Hamburg, and it's like Germany's biggest developer conference. So yeah, I had it already. It's just I needed to refresh my memory of what was actually in it because it's been a few months since I gave the talk.
Nice.
I've got a quick question around debugging with regards to queued events and kind of failures within them, and the kind of, just how you go around that, basically. If you've got any tips, and if there's perhaps a service you rely on to monitor those, whether that's part of your queue driver or...
So it will depend on your queue driver. Well, it doesn't have to. So we at UBSend use Sentry for our error tracking, and Sentry will still work on queued jobs because it's basically every time the queued job fires, it's booting your whole Laravel application. And so Sentry's part of that, or it's plugged into that, so it's still going to work. But if you don't want to go to the expense of using an error tracking service, you could use the database driver for queued events, and that actually ships with a failed jobs table. And if there's an exception thrown within that queue job executing, it dumps the stack trace into the database for you, so you can actually go and view it from there as well.
Looks like I was quite interested that we've got quite a lot of people behind on YouTube. So I don't know whether you're going to get like past events to that leveraging the events app with past votes, or how that works, but that should be curious. Just love for the Laravel Tailwind React. I'm sure we'll see a grimace from Chris momentarily on that side of things. Chris, you used to be all in on Vue, right? To a certain extent?
Yeah, because I wasn't very good at JavaScript at the time.
Okay.
Ooh.
Oh wait, hang on a minute.
Okay, that was very inflammatory. Sorry. But no, I preferred Vue syntactically because I was used to working with HTML, and then I got jobs working with React, and it just made a lot of sense. And now when I look at Vue code, it seems like it's trying to do a lot for me in a very restrictive way. It's the better way of saying what I originally said.
Yeah, I think you definitely get more flexibility writing in React. You have to, if you use Vue, you kind of have to conform to their conventions, whereas when you're writing React, I feel like you can do what you want.
You can really hang yourself in React, yeah.
There is that as well, yeah.
Awesome. Well, if there's no further questions from the YouTubes, I will drop the stream. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Likes and subscribes. And see you next week for something Vercel. Nearly forgot. Right. Bye.
Bye.